The Allies largely listened to one another and behaved as allies. At Yalta, Stalin had encouraged Britain and the United States to focus not on Berlin, but on the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. Striking there would destroy what remained of German war production. That is exactly what the Western Allies did. On April 1st, 1945, they launched the Ruhr Offensive. The result was the creation of the massive Ruhr Pocket. Roughly 300,000 German troops were taken prisoner. Army Group B was destroyed, and Germany lost its most important industrial region. Organized resistance in the area effectively ended by April 18th. The destruction of these reserves significantly helped the Soviet advance toward Berlin. At the same time, the Soviet Union made its own strategic compromises. The Western Allies feared that large German formations might escape southward into the Alps and continue fighting from so-called Alpine fortresses. To prevent this, Soviet forces carried out the Spremberg-Torgau operation. Marshal Ivan Konev undoubtedly hoped to earn the glory of becoming the first commander to enter Berlin. However, his starting position was less favorable than Zhukov's. Although he attempted to advance on the city from the south, his main assignment became linking up with the Western Allies. Beginning on April 19th, Konev's forces advanced toward Leipzig, Dresden, and the planned meeting line with Allied armies. The result came on April 25, 1945. Near the town of Torgau on the Elbe River, Soviet and American troops met for the first time. More specifically, Lieutenant Albert Kotzebue encountered a Soviet patrol led by Aitkali Alibekov near the village of Lechwitz. The following day, the meeting was officially documented. It was later immortalized in the famous photograph of Lieutenant Alexander Silvashko and Lieutenant William Robertson. Germany had now been physically divided into northern and southern sections. Communication and supply between them became nearly impossible. This made it easier both to eliminate remaining German forces and to attack Berlin without fear of major reinforcements arriving. By that point, Eisenhower had already informed Stalin that Berlin was not the primary objective of the Western Allies. Their focus would remain on destroying German forces in southern Germany, preventing them from reinforcing either the capital or Army Group North. Army Group North, despite controlling only limited territory, still represented one of the last significant concentrations of combat-effective German troops. Several 100,000 soldiers remained trapped along the Baltic coast. Although efforts were made to transfer some of them toward Berlin, Allied operations on every front severely disrupted these attempts. Meanwhile, another major German force was being destroyed in East Prussia. Supported by the French fighter regiment Normandy Niemen, Soviet troops completed the East Prussian offensive by mid-April. Königsberg fell on April 9th, and Army Group North ceased to exist as a coherent military formation. It had been the last force capable of influencing the outcome of the Berlin campaign. With its destruction, the Wehrmacht found itself effectively trapped inside the capital. At the same time, preparations for Berlin's defense were finally underway. By March 15th, after a series of failed counteroffensives, Hitler had become convinced that the main Soviet blow would not fall on Austria or Czechoslovakia. It would fall on Berlin. This is where we enter the most complex and controversial part of the story. In popular memory, the Battle of Berlin is often imagined as a single event: Soviet tank columns entering the city, Volkssturm militia defending the streets with Panzerfausts, and fierce urban combat raging everywhere. Depending on the source, the operation is either portrayed as a brilliant military masterpiece ahead of its time, or as a costly and unnecessary assault that should have been replaced by a siege. As usual, the truth lies somewhere in between. To begin with, Germany's overall plan for defending Berlin consisted of two separate elements. The first was the city itself. Berlin was divided into 9 defensive sectors. 8 of them had their own commanders, improvised anti-tank positions, anti-aircraft defenses, and units of the Volkssturm. The 9th sector, marked on military maps as the Citadel sector, formed a heavily fortified ring around the government district. This was intended to be the final stronghold where defenders would fight to the very end. The unusual feature of this system was that sector commanders often had little direct control over organized military formations. Troops entered the city from wherever they could break through and retreat. At the same time, Volkssturm units were being assembled throughout Berlin. The result resembled a constantly shifting mass of men and equipment moving around the city. However, once the code word Clausewitz was issued to signal the enemy's arrival, everything stopped. At that point, each sector commander simply took command of whatever forces happened to be available in his area. This was less a coherent military strategy than a form of symbolic resistance. And that is an important point. Hitler and the Wehrmacht leadership understood perfectly well that Berlin itself could not be held indefinitely. Their real hopes rested on the second element of the defense plan. This was the Oder-Neisse defensive line, located roughly 20 to 40 kilometers from Berlin. Here, the preparations were extremely serious. 3 defensive belts, each containing multiple trench systems, were supported by natural obstacles such as lakes, rivers, and ravines. Every village had been transformed into a fortified strongpoint. The key position was the Seelow Heights, the last major natural defensive barrier before Berlin. General Gotthard Heinrici, widely regarded as one of Germany's best defensive commanders, was placed in charge of Army Group Vistula. Nearby stood Army Group Center, assembled from whatever forces Germany could still gather. Together, they fielded roughly 1 million men, 10,000 artillery pieces, 1,500 tanks, and more than 3,000 aircraft. The Soviet side deployed approximately 2 million soldiers, 41,000 artillery pieces, over 6,000 tanks, and more than 7,500 aircraft. The numerical advantage was significant, but attacking and defending are not the same thing. Military historians generally agree that Germany's chances of ultimately stopping the Red Army were small. Yet, if such a chance existed at all, it depended on the defense of the Oder-Neisse line. The Berlin operation was therefore fought on 2 levels. There were not 1 million German soldiers hiding inside the city. Most German forces remained outside Berlin, and that fact is crucial to understanding the battle. When the Soviet artillery barrage began during the night of April 16th, the outcome of the campaign depended not on the streets of Berlin, but on whether this defensive line could be broken. Under the glare of searchlights intended to disrupt German night vision capabilities, Soviet troops advanced toward the Seelow Heights. The attack initially made good progress. However, additional German defensive positions soon slowed the advance and pushed Soviet forces back. According to Zhukov's later recollections, it became clear by early afternoon that the Seelow Heights could not be captured, according to the original plan. The solution was to commit the Soviet tank armies. Their arrival created a breakthrough in the German defenses. Through this opening, the main Soviet forces poured forward. The result was decisive. 4 days later, by April 20th, the outer defensive ring protecting Berlin had ceased to exist as an organized force. The first Soviet units entered the city itself. By April 25th, Berlin was completely surrounded. Most importantly, only around 13,000 soldiers from Army Group Vistula and the German Ninth Army managed to break through into the city. These men became the core of Berlin's defenders. Around them closed the Soviet forces of Zhukov from the east, Konev from the south, and Rokossovsky from the north. Now began the assault on Europe's second largest city after London. In 1945, Berlin was larger than New York City. Its 30 railway stations, 120 transit stations, and 80 kilometers of subway tunnels made it appear almost impregnable. Much has been written about the street fighting, and even more about the Panzerfaust. Yet there is an important nuance. Each of the 3 Soviet armies involved in the urban fighting lost roughly 100 tanks. Only about half of those losses were caused by Panzerfausts. For example, Bogdanov's Second Tank Army lost 70 vehicles out of a total of 685 during the assault on Berlin. Roughly 35 of those were destroyed by Panzerfausts. The weapon was certainly dangerous and often effective, but the perception that it was responsible for the majority of Soviet tank losses stems largely from the fact that Germany had already lost many of its traditional anti-tank capabilities, which had previously inflicted much heavier damage. In fact, overall Soviet tank losses in the Berlin campaign were lower than in several earlier operations. This highlights one of the main problems when assessing casualties during the Berlin offensive. Many accounts fail to distinguish between its 2 phases. They combine the losses suffered during the breakthrough at the Seelow Heights, the crossing of the Oder, and the vast encirclement operations, with those sustained during the fighting inside Berlin itself. As a result, some claims suggest that 2,000 Soviet tanks were destroyed in the city's streets. In reality, no more than about 500 were lost during the urban assault, while the rest belonged to the earlier stages of the operation. For comparison, the Battle of Kursk saw the loss of around 6,000 tanks, roughly 3 times the total losses of the entire Berlin campaign. Context matters. As for Berlin itself, the city fell after only 10 days of defense. By April 30th, fighting had already reached the Reichstag. Hitler, exhausted from sending non-existent reinforcements into battle, committed suicide. After his death, what remained of Germany's command structure rapidly disintegrated. Many commanders began considering surrender. Some units even raced westward in the hope of surrendering to American or British forces rather than the Soviets. A number of them succeeded. Most, however, surrendered to the Red Army inside Berlin on May 2nd. The speed of the city's collapse surprised everyone. General Omar Bradley, one of the senior Allied commanders, had estimated that taking Berlin would require at least a month and cost more than 100,000 irrecoverable casualties. Eisenhower expected even greater losses and cited this as one of the reasons the Western Allies chose not to advance on Berlin. The fact that the capital of the Reich fell in only 10 days was not exactly a shock, but it was a major surprise. This outcome gave rise to 2 sharply opposing interpretations and remains one of the central debates surrounding the battle. Supporters of the first view argue that Berlin should never have been stormed. Given the encirclement, blockade, and lack of German reserves, they believe the garrison would eventually have surrendered anyway. As evidence, they point to Breslau, modern-day Wrocław. During the Vistula-Oder offensive, Soviet forces simply surrounded the city and continued advancing toward Berlin. Critics of this theory respond with the same example. Breslau held out until May 6th, 4 days longer than Berlin itself. And Breslau was 5 times smaller than Berlin, both in population and in area. Its political importance was also nowhere near as great. Maintaining a blockade around Berlin carried serious risks. Surviving German forces might have attempted to break through to the city at any cost. Such attempts could well have succeeded. By April 25th, Soviet troops were maintaining an encirclement line stretching roughly 180 kilometers through forests, lakes, and rivers. It does not take a military genius to understand how many troops and resources would have been required to maintain such a perimeter. If Breslau could hold out for 3 months under similar circumstances, how long might Berlin have survived with vastly greater stockpiles and resources? No one can say. Nor can anyone accurately estimate the casualties that would have accumulated day after day, and might ultimately have exceeded those of the assault itself. Another argument sometimes used in favor of storming Berlin concerns the growing tensions between the Allies. Churchill did indeed develop Operation Unthinkable, a plan for a potential attack on the Soviet Union in the spring or summer of 1945, even contemplating the use of surviving German formations. Stalin was fully aware of these plans, but he also understood that their chances of success were highly questionable, and that no one was likely to attempt such an operation before at least the autumn of 1945. By then, Berlin would have fallen regardless. For that reason, it is highly unlikely that Churchill's plans or American political considerations played a major role in determining how or when Berlin was taken. In any case, Berlin was already encircled. The actual operation to capture the city took less time than the encirclement itself. This was noted by Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, who described the pace of the Soviet advance as impressive and considered the military decisions taken during the operation entirely sound and justified. The same issue applies to casualty figures. The often cited total of 78,291 irrecoverable Soviet casualties refers to the entire Berlin offensive, not merely the fighting within the city. Even today, historians cannot calculate the precise losses sustained during the urban battle alone. Most estimates suggest between 20 and 30,000 irrecoverable casualties, and roughly 100,000 total casualties, including the wounded. Supporters of the siege option frequently cite these figures. Yet, strictly speaking, such losses are modest compared with many other battles of the Second World War. They were not even comparable to Stalingrad, and were lower than those suffered during the Battle of Budapest. In fact, Budapest alone may have cost more irrecoverable casualties than the entire Berlin offensive. For that reason, the question can only be understood within the broader context of the Second World War. As for Berlin itself, after Germany's surrender, the Soviet Union fulfilled the agreements reached at Yalta. Despite having physical control of the city, Moscow handed over the sectors allocated to the United States, Britain, and France. From that decision emerged the Cold War, the division of Germany into two states, and eventually their reunification. And that is where this story comes to an end. Until next time, friends.